Lecture 72, Oscar Wilde.
Lady Bracknell speaks first. Are your parents living? Jack. I have lost both my parents. Both? To lose one parent may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both seems like carelessness. Who was your father? I am afraid I really don't know. I don't actually know who I am by birth. I was, found. Found? The late Mr. Thomas Cardew, an old gentleman of a very charitable and kindly disposition, found me and gave me the name of Worthing because he happened to have a first-class ticket for Worthing in his pocket. Worthing is a seaside resort. Where did the charitable gentleman who had a first-class ticket for this seaside resort find you? In a handbag. A handbag? In the first act of Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest, a grand old dowager named Lady Bracknell thus interrogates a young man who wishes to marry her daughter, Gwendolen. He's a pleasant young man with an income of £7,000 or £8,000 a year, over $500,000 in today's money, plus a townhouse in London's quintessentially fashionable Belgrave Square, and a country estate of some 1,500 acres. In a world where wealth and social position alone can determine the suitability of a suitor, Jack would seem to pass with flying colors, even though his chief occupation is smoking and he claims to know absolutely nothing. Lady Bracknell approves of smoking as an occupation and is pleased to learn that Jack is totally ignorant. Ignorance, she says, is like a delicate fruit. Touch it and the bloom is gone. Nevertheless, she is dismayed to learn that Jack knows nothing of his parents and was simply a foundling. He was found, he says, in a handbag that was left in the cloakroom at London's Victoria Station. Wilde is thus putting his own special twist on a theme long established in English fiction, especially in the novels of Dickens, the theme of the foundling. In the classic version of the foundling story, a child of obscured parentage who has been humbly or even harshly raised by foster parents turns out to be descended from a noble or distinguished family and is at last recognized as such and granted all the privileges that go with an exalted pedigree. By the time Wilde wrote his play, English novelists had played any number of variations on this theme. In Dickens' Great Expectations, for instance, Pip is a foundling of sorts, orphaned in infancy and raised to be a common laborer until he is found, so to speak, by a mysterious benefactor who underwrites his transformation into a splendid gentleman. But the benefactor turns out to be a convict whose wealth is confiscated just before his execution. So in the end, Pip is forced to make his own way in the world. Still more wrenching is the story of Tess in Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, published just 4 years before Wilde's play opened. As we've seen in this novel, when a poor country peddler named Durbeyfield learns that he may be descended from a grand old Norman family named d'Urberville, his wife makes their daughter Tess claim kin with a nearby family named d'Urberville, but the resulting chain of events leads to catastrophe, the execution of Tess herself for murder. Wilde's twist on the foundling story is anything but tragic. It is instead wildly irreverent. Though Jack has no idea who his parents were, he is fabulously rich and, at the time of his interview with Lady Bracknell, freshly engaged to the young woman that he wants to marry. His only problem lies in his name, which is really what the whole play turns on. Though he was christened John Worthing by his charitable benefactor, he calls himself Jack when he stays in his country house, and Ernest whenever he comes up to London. When his London friend Algernon asks him why he's Jack in the country and Ernest in town, Jack explains that out in the country he's the guardian of a young woman named Cecily, the granddaughter of his benefactor. As her guardian, he feels obliged to adopt what he calls a very high moral tone on all subjects. But since he also likes to have a good time, he's invented a black sheep younger brother named Ernest, who lives in town, gets himself into all sorts of trouble, and thus presumably needs his elder brother to come to town and get him out of it. The name game thus played by Jack deliciously spoofs the ideal of high seriousness, high earnestness, nurtured by the sages of the Victorian period, most conspicuously by Matthew Arnold. It was actually an American poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who plangently proclaimed in the middle of the 19th century, "Life is real, life is earnest." But in an essay on poetry that appeared in 1880, just 15 years before Wilde's play, Matthew Arnold wrote that great poetry exudes a, quote, higher seriousness, higher even than the seriousness of history. Wilde knew and admired Arnold's own poetry, but a few years before writing The Importance of Being Earnest, he had already challenged Arnold's theory of criticism, which was really a theory of all art and science. Arnold had roundly declared that the object of all study should be to see the object as in itself it really is. Wilde flatly disagreed. In a dialogue that he wrote called The Critic as Artist, a character named Ernest learns from a character named Gilbert that Arnold was all wet, that the primary aim of the critic is to see the object as in itself it really is not. Crazy as it sounds, this Wildean twist on Arnold's bedrock principle of criticism can help us to see what is really happening in Wilde's play, which he subtitled A Trivial Comedy for Serious People. Wilde's play mocks the higher seriousness, or high seriousness, that Arnold finds in all great literature. Yet this trivial comedy manages to say something serious about the slipperiness of our language, about the shakiness even of bedrock words like earnest and serious. Wilde's play turns the whole notion of earnestness upside down, for in many ways it's about the importance of being playful. Ernest, Jack's imaginary brother, belies his name. He's a frivolous playboy who often requires the help of his sober-sided brother Jack, though Jack has invented this playboy just so that he, Jack, can come up to town and play. Nevertheless, while Jack pretends to be seriously concerned for the welfare of his imaginary brother, he is truly serious about one thing. He wants to marry Gwendolen. Loving him passionately, she in turn wants to marry him. But his chief attraction for her is his name, which she thinks is Ernest. "My ideal," she tells him, "has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest." Well, what's in a name? For Gwendolen, just about everything. When Jack gently tries to get her to admit that she might be able to love him even if his name wasn't Ernest, she won't budge. He's got to be named Ernest, and as I've already said, the whole play turns on that name. In the winter of 1895, when this play opened in London, Oscar Wilde stood at the height of his fame. Born in Dublin in 1854, he was the son of a distinguished surgeon, Sir William Wilde, and a poet, Lady Jane Francesca Wilde, who kept the most celebrated salon in Dublin. After early schooling in Ireland, he soon enough distinguished himself at Oxford, where he was known for his dandified dress, his flamboyant behavior, his contempt for conventional morality, and his command of classical literature. By 1881, when he published his first collection of poems, he was known well enough beyond Oxford to be caricatured as a long-haired, lily-bearing aesthete in Patience, an opera by Gilbert and Sullivan. The following year, not yet out of his 20s, he took off on a lecture tour of the United States. When he was asked by a customs officer if he had anything to declare, Wilde reportedly answered, "Only my genius." Modesty was not his style. On his return to England, he claimed to have single-handedly civilized America by spreading the gospel of art. He then set about showing that he could produce art, verbal art that is, as well as talk about it. Along with a series of provocative essays such as The Decay of Lying and The Critic as Artist, he published in 1891 his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is the strange story of a man and his portrait. While the portrait of Dorian grows old and ugly, the living man remains young and handsome, even after murdering the painter. But when he finally stabs the portrait, in hopes of killing the memory of his own vicious past, he actually kills himself. And in that moment, he changes form with the painting. The painting now shows him in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty, while he himself, or rather his prostrate corpse, is suddenly withered, wrinkled, and loathsome. In the preface to his novel, Wilde proclaimed the doctrines of the aesthetic movement, starting with the precept that the artist is the creator of beautiful things. For Wilde, beauty transcended morality. There is no such thing, he wrote, as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. But that is hardly all there is to be said about Dorian Gray. The three main characters of this book, Dorian, the painter, Basil Hallward, and the aesthetician, Lord Henry, together reflect aspects of Wilde's own personality, including his homosexuality. Dorian is named after a young poet named John Gray, who was one of Wilde's lovers. And Dorian elicits love from both of the other two characters in the novel. But exposing the true nature of the man they love, the novel also exposes the price to be paid for an absolute aestheticism. Wilde himself said that in his attempt to kill conscience, Dorian Gray kills himself. Or as Richard Ellman says, to seek to become an aesthetic object outside of time is to die. So the book has a moral, and its moral is that viciousness will sooner or later make beauty forfeit its very life. Having made a sensation with his novel, Wilde turned to the writing of plays. Of these, the most notorious is Salome, written in French and first published in French in France, in 1893. In the following summer, a London production of the play with Sarah Bernhardt in the title role was banned by the Lord Chamberlain, the licensor of plays. The banning of Salome infuriated Wilde, but should not have surprised him. In this play, which revises the Bible story, Salome is both the daughter of King Herod and the would-be lover of John the Baptist, whom she tries in vain to seduce. You won't find that in the Bible, but you find it in Wilde. When she fails, she demands his head on a platter, and in the very last words that she speaks in the play, just before Herod orders her crushed to death, she glories in pressing her lips to the mouth of a severed and bleeding head. I have kissed your mouth, Yochanan. I have kissed your mouth. When a young artist named Aubrey Beardsley depicted this ghastly kiss in a print that appeared in April 1893, it is said to have aroused more horror and indignation than any graphic work hitherto produced in England. Apart from Salome, which stands in a class by itself, Wilde wrote 4 plays about London society, all staged from 1892 to 1895. Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest. The first 3 are all about threats to marital fidelity. In Lady Windermere's Fan, which ran in London for much of 1892, the title character is a rigidly puritanical young wife who suspects her husband of keeping a mistress and is herself pursued by the wicked Lord Darlington, who persuades her to come alone to his house. But the supposed villains of this play turn out to be, in their own way, the saviors of the heroine. Although Lord Darlington ridicules conventional pieties and conventional morality, he's not really wicked. He truly cares for Lady Windermere, believes that her husband is treating her badly, and wants to save her from unhappiness. Furthermore, the supposed mistress of Lord Windermere is not his mistress at all, though she is a fallen woman. Years ago, she ran off with a lover and left behind a baby daughter who was told that her mother was dead. When this runaway mother learned that her daughter had grown up to marry Lord Windermere, she started blackmailing Lord Windermere, making him pay to keep her identity hidden from her straight-laced daughter. But when the daughter herself decides to run off with Lord Darlington, it is her own mother who begs her not to repeat her own mistake and who saves her daughter's reputation. Never revealing herself to Lady Windermere, she cleverly prevents Lord Windermere from ever learning that his wife went to see Lord Darlington one night at his house. Ending as it does with the reconciliation of Lord and Lady Windermere, Lady Windermere's fan seems to endorse the value and virtue of marital fidelity. But Wilde's plays repeatedly expose the hypocrisy and secrecy on which conventional morality is founded. In virtually all other plays about secrets, including Wilde's own Importance of Being Earnest, the secrets are eventually revealed to all parties concerned in them. But in Lady Windermere's fan, the secrets are kept to the very end. To ensure the survival of the Windermere marriage, Lady Windermere must never learn the truth about her mother, and Lord Windermere must never learn that his wife started to run off with another man. Wilde's plays tell unpleasant truths about marriage. In A Woman of No Importance, Lady Stutfield asks Mrs. Allenby, "Do tell me your conception of the ideal husband." "The ideal husband?" says Mrs. Allenby. "There couldn't be such a thing. The institution is wrong." In Wilde's own play called An Ideal Husband, the title character is a distinguished politician of middle age who made his fortune by selling an official secret when he was young. Blackmailed by a woman who threatens to expose him unless he publicly supports a speculative scheme that he detests, Sir Robert Chiltern reluctantly agrees to support the scheme and then explains to his adoring wife why he must do so. He thus shatters her faith in him. But when she deplores the ruination of what she calls the ideal of my life, he faults her for taking him as ideal in the first place. "There was your mistake," he says. "Why can't women love us, faults and all? It is not the perfect, but the imperfect who have need of love. All sins, except a sin against love itself, love should forgive." Sir Robert voices the moral of the play, which shows how his rigidly puritanical wife, Lady Chiltern, finally learns to forgive, to recognize that human beings cannot always live by absolute moral standards. When Sir Robert's friend Lord Goring contrives to foil the blackmailing woman and thus frees Sir Robert to denounce the speculative scheme in Parliament, Lady Chiltern nevertheless demands that he resign from politics, even though he's just been offered a seat in the cabinet. Though he agrees to refuse it, Lord Goring begs her not to make him do so. Echoing what Sir Robert himself told her earlier, he says, "Women are not meant to judge us, but to forgive us when we need forgiveness." Lady Chiltern does forgive him, and shortly after she feels bound to confess a fault of her own. Though she remains sinless in the eyes of her husband, she is no longer an idealizing wife. She has traded her ideal husband for a real man. Now, all this may seem wise and reasonable and humane. Even as the play exposes the rigidity of conventional morality and ideal standards, it teaches the quintessentially Christian virtue of forgiveness. But to compare the ideal husband in Wilde's other plays about marriage with those of Henrik Ibsen, his great Norwegian contemporary, is to see that Wilde was anything but a feminist. In spite of his sympathy for the so-called fallen woman, in spite of his gospel of forgiveness, and in spite of his demand that we accept human frailty, none of Wilde's married women ever walks out on her husband. That's what Nora Helmer does at the end of A Doll's House, which Ibsen wrote in 1879, a full 15 years before Wilde's ideal husband. In Wilde's plays about marriage, wives end up reconciled to their husbands, sometimes on remarkably confining terms. Take the ending of The Ideal Husband as a case in point. In Lord Goring's final speech to Lady Chiltern, he begs her not to make her husband resign from politics, begs her to let him remain in politics because, quote, "a man's life is of more value than a woman's. It has larger issues, wider scope, greater ambitions. A woman's life revolves in curves of emotions. Don't make any terrible mistake, Lady Chiltern. A woman who can keep a man's love and love him in return has done all the world wants of women or should want of them. So says Lord Goring, supposedly the most enlightened character in the play, who surely speaks for Wilde himself. What he preaches to Lady Chiltern is not just the gospel of forgiveness, but the gospel of submission, which she dutifully learns. A few lines later, telling her husband not to resign from politics, she simply repeats, word for word, what Lord Goring has just said to her about men and women. She has thus learned how to be an ideal wife to her not-so-ideal husband. So Wilde was not a radical reformer. In the great march of social progress, he lags not only behind Ibsen, but also behind his near contemporary, George Bernard Shaw. In both Lady Windermere's Fan and A Woman of No Importance, women of dubious reputation hide their identities or their sexual indiscretions from their children so that those children can marry well. Something quite different happens in Mrs. Warren's Profession, which Shaw wrote in 1893, the very same year that Lady Windermere's Fan opened. Here the fallen woman is not a society lady, but a prostitute, a madam, in fact, who ably defends her own way of life. Nothing so challenging to the social order can be found in the plays of Oscar Wilde. But if Wilde's plays are short on revolutionary vision, they are rich in wit. And this is nowhere more evident than in his last and greatest play, where he turns from the strains of marriage to the suspense, confusion, and comedy of courtship. Opening appropriately on Valentine's Day in 1895, can't you imagine that? The perfect Valentine's Day date in 1895 was to attend the opening of The Importance of Being Earnest. The Importance of Being Earnest is the most deliciously witty play Wilde ever wrote. Taking dead aim at Victorian earnestness, as we have already begun to see, he turns all conventional pieties upside down, exploding the gravity of such fundamental words as serious. When Jack offhandedly agrees to have dinner with Algernon says, "Yes, but you must be serious about it. I hate people who are not serious about meals. It is so shallow of them." So it takes a serious eater to be deep. A philosopher who skimps on meals would be shallow and serious. What do these words mean? At one point in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which appeared some 30 years before Wilde's play, the words important and unimportant become virtually interchangeable. In Wilde's play, words like earnest and trivial change places. Let's remember, Ernest is the name of an imaginary playboy invented by Jack. When Algernon learns that Jack has a beautiful young ward named Cecily living out at his estate in Hertfordshire, he decides to pay her a visit under the name of Ernest. Since Cecily finds her Uncle Jack to be so very serious as to seem positively ill, and since she has been led to believe that Jack's brother Ernest is really wicked, she is eager to see for herself just how wicked he is, and somewhat disappointed when he turns up looking just like everyone else and denying that he's wicked. "If you are not," she says, "then you have certainly been deceiving us all in a very inexcusable manner. I hope you have not been leading a double life, pretending to be wicked and being really good all the time. That would be hypocrisy." In this topsy-turvy world, hypocrisy means just the opposite of what it normally means. But as we've already begun to see, the one word in this play that gets turned completely upside down is earnest, as both a name, E-R-N-E-S-T, and an adjective, E-A-R-N-E-S-T. Gwendolen loves Jack, but she believes that his name is Ernest. And she is so earnestly devoted to this name that she cannot imagine loving him or marrying him without it. So consider this sequence of events. First, Gwendolen accepts a proposal from Jack, who calls himself Ernest. Then, masquerading as Ernest, Algernon proposes to Cecily. When Gwendolen learns that a man named Ernest Worthing has proposed to Cecily, she is furious with Cecily for presuming to take her man, until Gwendolen learns that she herself is actually engaged to a man named Jack. At the same time, Cecily learns that her fiancé's name is not Ernest, but Algernon. Both women now decide that in spite of all the attractions possessed by the two men, their names are an insuperable barrier to marriage. Fortunately, however, names can be changed. The men now propose to get themselves christened, which leaves the women gasping with admiration. Gwendolen is particularly amazed. "How absurd," she says, "to talk of the equality of the sexes. Where questions of self-sacrifice are concerned, men are infinitely beyond us." Before they can be christened, however, Lady Bracknell cracks the mystery of Jack's parentage. Determined to know just who his parents were, she finds a clue in the name of Miss Prism, Cecily's governess. Miss Prism, who once worked for the Bracknells, left their house 28 years before in charge of a baby boy in the perambulator. A baby boy whom she thoughtlessly left in a handbag in a cloakroom at Victoria Station. This baby boy, the long-lost son of Lady Bracknell's sister, is now, of course, found or refound as our very own Jack Worthing. Furthermore, we learn he was named for his now dead father, General Moncrief, whose Christian name was, yes, you guessed it, Ernest. This revelation lays the groundwork for the very last line of the play, where the true meaning of its title comes out. Jack proudly tells Gwendolen that he is naturally called Ernest, throws his arm around her and cries out, "Gwendolen, at last!" Lady Bracknell then says sternly, "My nephew, you seem to be displaying signs of triviality." To which Jack replies, "On the contrary, Aunt Augusta, I've now realized for the first time in my life the vital importance of being earnest." Trivial and serious at once, the whole play seems calculated to culminate in that final, definitive, wonderful pun. In a just and generous world, Oscar Wilde would have lived to write more plays and to go on relishing the wealth and acclaim that his sparkling wit had brought him. But even as the importance of being earnest delighted virtually all who saw it, a treacherous turn of events contrived to cast its author from the height of fame to the depths of disgrace. Two things did him in. One was England's Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which forbade gross indecency between males. The other was Oscar Wilde's predilection for young men, above all his fatal addiction to Lord Alfred Douglas, nicknamed Bosie, a handsome but spoiled and maniacally selfish young man who recklessly exploited Wilde and goaded him into making the worst mistake of his life, an act of pure, self-destructive folly. Just 4 days after the importance of being earnest opened, Bosie's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, left a card at Wilde's London club inscribed, "To Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." Instead of simply ignoring the semi-literate slur, as he could easily have done, Wilde felt bound to retaliate, to prosecute Queensberry for libel because Bosie insisted on it. Wilde might as well have tried to spank a scorpion, for in attacking the fiercely vindictive Queensberry, who easily beat the charge of libel, Wilde opened himself up to prosecution for gross indecency, which led to his conviction and the maximum penalty, 2 years of imprisonment with hard labor. Near the end of those 2 years, Wilde wrote a long and soul-searching letter to Bosie that was never sent to him, but given back to Wilde on his release. He entitled the letter De Profundis, after the Latin words of Psalm 130. "Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord." Wrung from the depths of misery, Wilde's letter is both a lacerating indictment of Bosie and a humiliating act of self-accusation. "I must say to myself," Wilde writes, "that neither you nor your father, multiplied 1,000 times over, could possibly have ruined a man like me, that I ruined myself, and that nobody, great or small, can be ruined except by his own hand." In this letter, which runs to almost 75 printed pages in his complete works, Wilde painstakingly documents all of the ways in which Bosie abused his hospitality and kindness. But in the end, Wilde writes to forgive Bosie for his own sake. Forgiveness, the gospel preached again and again in Wilde's plays, was the end result of the agonizing process of purgation that Wilde underwent in prison. "I have lain in prison," he writes, "for 2 years. Out of my nature has come wild despair, an abandonment to grief that was piteous even to look at, terrible and impotent rage, bitterness and scorn, anguish that wept aloud, misery that could find no voice, sorrow that was dumb. Now I find hidden away in my own nature something that tells me that nothing in the whole world is meaningless, and suffering least of all, that something hidden away in my nature, like a treasure in a field, is humility. Wilde wrote this letter to redeem his own suffering, to make it meaningful, to make, as he said, every single degradation of the body into a spiritualizing of the soul. Released from prison in 1897, Wilde felt sure that he could write again as before, but the only work of literature he produced was a poem spun from his memories of prison, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, published in 1898. 2 years later, Wilde died under circumstances uncannily prefigured in the importance of being earnest. When Jack decides to kill off his imaginary brother Ernest, he tells the parish rector that Ernest died in a Paris hotel, exactly as Wilde himself would die. But if Wilde unwittingly foresaw the place of his own death, the mood of it was anticipated in a little poem written more than 200 years before his birth by a celebrated courtier, adventurer, and poet of the Elizabethan era named Walter Raleigh. "What is our life?" he asks. "A play of passion," he answers. "A play in which we make our way from the dressing room of the womb to the drawn curtains of the grave. Thus march we playing to our latest rest. Only we die in earnest. That's no jest."